Welcome to my channel. I hope you relish this tale. Let's commence. I positioned myself in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie. Another day, another transaction to finalize. Life was splendid, or so I believed. My reflection gazed back at me, self-assured and poised. Salvador Bell, the individual who possessed everything. "Honey, have you spotted my blue folder?" Crystal's inquiry floated from the bedroom. "Examine the study," I responded. Our child, Victoria, sprinted into the chamber, her braids bobbing. "Daddy, can we visit the park after class?" I crouched to match her enthusiastic eyes. "Absolutely, princess. I'll fetch you at 3:30 sharp." Crystal showed up in the entryway, her expression preoccupied. "I've got a delayed conference tonight. Don't hold dinner for me." I scowled again. That was the third instance this week. She gestured indifferently. "You understand how it is. The Henderson account is vital." Something in her intonation seemed amiss, but I disregarded the notion. "Fine, I'll look after Victoria." As Crystal hurried off, scarcely halting to peck Victoria goodbye. I couldn't dismiss the feeling that something was amiss. Over recent weeks, she had grown increasingly remote. Our once fervent relationship had chilled to lukewarm, trivial chatter and routine gestures. At work, it was tough to concentrate. My thoughts continually drifted to Crystal's mannerisms, the abandoned plans, the premature exits, the way she shunned my embrace. It felt like cohabiting with a stranger. My mobile vibrated. A message from Crystal: "Running late. Don't collect Victoria. Tracy will bring her home." I sighed, massaging my temples. This wasn't the initial time Crystal had neglected our daughter. Victoria's disheartened expression loomed in my thoughts, and a wave of irritation surged in my chest. As I drove back, I resolved to confront Crystal. This couldn't persist. Our family was disintegrating, and I required explanations. The residence was unlit upon my arrival. No trace of Victoria or Crystal. I checked my watch. 7:30 p.m. Where were they? I dialed Tracy's number, Crystal's closest ally. "Hey Tracy, it's Salvador. Is Victoria with you?" "Oh, hi Salvador." Tracy's tone was conspicuously jovial. "Yes, she's here. Crystal asked me to keep her overnight. Didn't she inform you?" My hand clenched the phone tighter. "No, she didn't." "Where's Crystal?" She mentioned she had a work dinner. "I'm sure she'll be home soon." I could detect the deceit in Tracy's voice. "Thanks, Tracy. Tell Victoria I love her." Hanging up, a chilling dread settled in my gut. Crystal wasn't at work. She wasn't with our daughter. Where on earth was she? I paced the living room, scenarios racing through my mind. Was she in jeopardy, having an affair? The idea made my blood boil. Hours ticked by. I dialed Crystal's mobile incessantly, each attempt redirected to voicemail. By midnight, I was poised to contact the authorities. Then, at 1 a.m., I heard the front door open. Crystal staggered in, her hair tousled and attire crumpled. "Where have you been?" I interrogated, my voice steady yet firm. She flinched, startled by my presence. "Salvador, I mentioned I had a late conference." "Don't deceive me," I snarled, advancing. "I phoned your office. They stated you departed at 5. Crystal's eyes flitted around the chamber, evading my stare. I went out for drinks with some colleagues, lost track of time." "And your phone? Why didn't you respond?" "Battery expired," she muttered, pushing past me toward the bedroom. I seized her arm, compelling her to confront me. "What's happening, Crystal? And don't claim it's nothing. You've been peculiar for weeks." For a brief moment, I discerned fear flicker in her eyes. Then it vanished, replaced by icy defiance. "I owe you no explanations, Salvador. Release me." I let go of her arm, stunned by the venom in her tone. This wasn't the woman I had wed. As she stormed into the bedroom, I stood there, my world seemingly disintegrating. Sleep was elusive that night. I lay awake, reassembling every interaction, every pretext, every missed call. The fragments were aligning, crafting a narrative. I didn't desire to acknowledge that my wife was concealing something, but I was determined to uncover whatever it was, regardless of the expense. The subsequent days merged into a haze of suspicion and quiet tension. Crystal and I barely communicated, circling each other like tired strangers. I immersed myself in work, yet my thoughts were preoccupied with discovering the truth. One evening, as Crystal prepared to depart, I nonchalantly inquired, "Where are you headed?" "Book club," she answered, avoiding eye contact. I nodded, watching her hurry out the door. As soon as her car was out of sight, I seized my keys. It was time to conclude this facade. Tracking Crystal's car proved challenging. She navigated a circuitous route, backtracking several times, but I was ready for this. Maintaining a distance, my heart throbbed as we ventured beyond the familiar streets of our neighborhood. Eventually, Crystal's vehicle pulled into the Rosewood Hotel's parking lot. A knot formed in my stomach as I observed her alight, smoothing her dress and inspecting her reflection in the car window. I parked across the street, my hands trembling as I extracted my phone to record. Crystal entered the hotel lobby, her gaze sweeping the area. Then I spotted him, a tall, well-dressed man with sandy hair. He approached Crystal with a closeness that ignited fury within me. Toby R. I recognized him from Crystal's work gatherings. The way he placed his hand on her lower back, the intimate smile they exchanged, it was all the confirmation I required. I yearned to burst in there, to confront them both, but a cold, calculating part of my mind restrained me. I needed more proof, more advantage. For the next hour, I sat in my car, capturing photos and recording snippets of their dialogue whenever they passed the windows. Each laugh, each touch, felt like a dagger in my heart. When they eventually exited, Toby drew Crystal close, kissing her passionately. I clenched my steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened, resisting the urge to confront them as Crystal drove off. I trailed Toby. He led me to a posh apartment complex across town. I noted the address, already devising a plan. The following day, I feigned illness to skip work while Crystal was at the office. I decided to visit Tracy. It was time to secure some answers. Tracy opened the door, her insincere smile wavering upon seeing my stern face. "Salvador, what are you doing here?" I barged past her into the residence. "We need to talk, Tracy." Now she wrung her hands nervously. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Stop the nonsense," I snapped. "I'm aware of Toby. I know Crystal has been deceitful. What I don't comprehend is how long you've been aiding her." Tracy's expression collapsed. "Salvador, I'm terribly sorry. Paul, Crystal swore me to secrecy." "Tell me everything," I demanded, my voice icy. Thus, the entire sordid saga spilled out. Crystal and Toby had been involved for months. They planned to elope, taking Victoria with them. She intended to leave you penniless. Tracy sobbed. "Toby has been assisting her in transferring funds. They aimed to empty your accounts and vanish." I listened in grim silence, each revelation intensifying the rage brewing within me. When Tracy concluded, I rose. "Salvador, what will you do?" she asked, fear evident in her eyes. I regarded her, my tone unnervingly calm. "Nothing for you to fret about, Tracy. But should you divulge any part of this discussion to anyone, particularly Crystal, you'll regret it." She nodded, tears cascading down her cheeks. As I drove to Toby's apartment, my thoughts were piercingly clear. The pain, the betrayal, it all merged into a single, driven purpose. They believed they could ruin me. I'd demonstrate what destruction truly was. Toby's building had lacked security. It was surprisingly easy to infiltrate. I unlocked his door using a skill from my more adventurous days that now proved invaluable. The apartment was sleek and modern, saturated with the scent of expensive cologne. I systematically sifted through drawers and files, capturing photographs of anything potentially useful: bank statements, emails, love letters from Crystal. Each find fueled my fury. I was so engrossed in my task that I almost missed the sound of a key in the lock. Panic surged as I realized Toby had returned early. With no place to conceal myself as the door swung open, I made a quick decision. I snatched a hefty crystal paperweight from the desk and positioned myself behind the door. Toby entered, humming to himself. As he turned to shut the door, I struck. The paperweight connected with a disturbing thud, and Toby collapsed to the floor. For a moment, I stood frozen in shock, then my training kicked in. I checked for a pulse. It was weak. "This wasn't the plan," I muttered. But looking at Toby's motionless form, a peculiar calm enveloped me. In some way, he had simplified matters. I quickly surveyed the room, my mind whirring. I couldn't reverse what had happened, but I could manipulate the story. Swiftly, I made the apartment resemble a robbery gone awry. I pocketed some money and valuables, smashed a window, and meticulously wiped down every surface I had touched. As I left, I felt no remorse, no guilt, only satisfaction. Toby had attempted to take everything from me in the end. I had taken everything from him. Now, it was Crystal's turn. The following days required a delicate balancing act. I had to maintain the guise of an unsuspecting husband while meticulously covering my tracks. News of Toby's death spread rapidly, sending shockwaves through Crystal's social circle. I observed her intently, noting every twitch, every poorly concealed tear. She was adept at masking her sorrow, but not sufficiently so. To the world, she appeared as a concerned colleague. To me, she was a widow in all but name. Such a tragedy. Crystal murmured during dinner, pushing her food around her plate. Toby was a significant asset to the team. I nodded solemnly, taking a sip of wine. Indeed. The police suspect it was a robbery, she commented, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her glass. That's the current theory. It's just so senseless, life often is, I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. As days passed, Crystal's behavior grew increasingly erratic, alternating between periods of eerie calm and sudden bursts of anger or tears. I knew it was only a matter of time before she unraveled. I needed an ally, someone utterly trustworthy. That's when I turned to my best friend, Santos. Santos and I had a long history, dating back to our law enforcement training days. He had left the force to start his own security firm but maintained his connections. More importantly, he was the only person I fully trusted. We met at a secluded bar on the city outskirts. Santos took one look at my face and ordered a bottle of whiskey. "All right, amigo," he said, pouring us each a generous measure. "Spill it." I recounted everything: the affair, the conspiracy against me, and what had transpired with Toby. Santos listened silently, his expression inscrutable. When I finished, he exhaled a long, low whistle. "Damn, that's a complex mess, I know," I said, downing my drink. "But I need your help, Santos. I can't be implicated in this. I have Victoria to consider." Santos leaned back, his gaze calculating. "What do you need? An alibi for the night Toby died, and advice on how to stay ahead of the investigation?" I requested. Santos stared at me for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but you follow my lead." No questions asked, relief washed over me. "Got it. Thank you, Santos." Over the next few hours, we meticulously crafted my alibi. Santos would vouch that we were together that night, working late on a new security system for my company. We reviewed every detail to ensure our stories aligned flawlessly. "Now," Santos said, his voice grave and serious, "you need to eliminate anything that could link you to Toby's place. Clothes, shoes, everything. Burn them if necessary." I nodded, memorizing his instructions. "And Salvador," he added, gripping my arm, "no matter what happens, stick to the story. Even if they bring Crystal in, even if she breaks. You know nothing." "Understood, understood," I replied. As I drove home that night, I experienced a peculiar mix of fear and exhilaration. The stakes had shifted. It was no longer merely about exposing Crystal, it was about survival. The following weeks were akin to a tightrope walk. At work, I maintained a facade of normalcy, securing deals and engaging clients, but internally I was constantly alert, anticipating further complications. Crystal's pregnancy announcement struck like a bombshell. She cornered me one evening, her eyes frenzied and desperate. "I'm pregnant, Salvador," she blurted out. It's our miracle." I felt the color drain from my face. Our miracle, the cruelest irony of all. "That's wonderful news," I managed to articulate, even as my mind whirled. The timing, the desperation in her tone, there was no doubt in my mind about the paternity of the child. Crystal wrapped her arms around me, weeping. I embraced her rigidly, my heart hardening. She believed this would save her, tether me to her. She had no idea of the tempest that was approaching. As Crystal stepped back, wiping her tears, I resolved to play along for the time being. Let her think she had the upper hand, but ultimately, she would lose everything, just as she had intended for me. "We should celebrate," I suggested, mustering a smile. "I'll make dinner reservations for tomorrow." Crystal's face lit up with relief. "Oh, Salvador, I was so concerned. I thought with all the distance between us lately." I caressed her cheek, the gesture affectionate, yet my touch was devoid of warmth. "Nonsense. This changes everything." As I held my unfaithful wife, my mind was already plotting several moves ahead. The child complicated matters, but also presented new opportunities. If the child was Toby's, a paternity test would serve as damning evidence. If by some chance it was mine, that would certainly spice up any custody disputes. Later that night, as Crystal slept tranquilly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts in turmoil. The man I once was trusting, optimistic, perhaps somewhat naive, had vanished. In his place was someone tougher, colder, a man who would stop at nothing to safeguard what was his. I thought of Victoria, innocent and oblivious to the chaos unfolding around her. I'd shield her from the worst of it, but I recognized the upcoming months would irrevocably alter her life. The guilt of this weighed on me, but it was eclipsed by a stronger emotion: determination. Crystal and Toby had attempted to ruin me, to dismantle my family. Instead, they had unleashed something they couldn't have foreseen. I would have my vengeance, my justice, and when the dust settled, I'd reconstruct my life from the ashes of their deceit. As dawn broke, I finally succumbed to sleep. In my dreams, I stood victorious over the ruins of Crystal's meticulously crafted lies, a vision of the future I was resolved to actualize. The knock on my office door jolted me from my reverie. I looked up to see Detective Fred Phillips at the doorway, his keen eyes scrutinizing every aspect of my office. "Mr. Bell," he said, his voice gruff but professional, "I'm Detective Phillips. I was hoping we could discuss Toby Rowe." I motioned to the chair across from my desk, my expression one of polite concern. "Of course, Detective. Please take a seat." As Phillips settled in, I noticed his gaze dart over my face, searching for any hint of nervousness or guilt. I met his eyes steadily, resolved not to reveal anything. "Mr. Bell, where were you on the night of July 15th?" Phillips inquired, pulling out a notepad. I leaned back in my chair, the epitome of relaxation. "I was working late with my friend Santos Witt. We're implementing a new security system for my company. Can anyone else corroborate that?" I shook my head. "Just Santos. We were the only ones in the office that night." Phillips scribbled something down, his expression inscrutable. "And your relationship with Mr. Rowe? I understand he worked with your wife." "Purely professional," I replied. I responded calmly. "We'd met at a few work events, but I didn't know him closely." The detective's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your wife seems quite distressed by his death." I allowed a trace of concern to appear on my face. "Crystal has always been empathetic. Any death affects her deeply, especially that of a colleague I see," Phillips murmured. He paused, then inquired, "Mr. Bell, are you aware that Mr. Rowe made several large cash withdrawals in the weeks leading up to his death?" My heart rate increased, but I maintained a neutral expression. "No, I wasn't aware." "Is that significant?" Phillips shrugged. "It could be inconsequential, but in my experience, when people start moving large amounts of money, they're usually planning something." I leaned forward, injecting just the right amount of curiosity into my voice. "Planning what exactly?" "That's what we're trying to determine," Phillips replied, standing up. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Bell. We'll be in touch if we have any more questions." As I watched him leave, I knew this was far from over. Phillips was astute, too astute. I'd have to tread cautiously. Later that evening, I arrived home to find Crystal pacing in the living room, her face pale and distressed. "Salvador," she said, her voice trembling, "the police were here. They asked so many questions about Toby." I pulled her into an embrace, feeling her tremble against me. "It's okay, Crystal. They're just doing their job." She pulled back, her eyes frantic. "But what if they find out?" "Find out what, Crystal?" "We have nothing to hide," I stated firmly. The lie hung between us, heavy and unspoken. Crystal's eyes shifted away, unable to meet mine. I just meant about the project we were working on," she mumbled. "It was confidential," I nodded, pretending to accept her flimsy excuse. "Don't worry, everything will be fine." As Crystal retreated to the bedroom, I poured myself a drink, my mind racing. The investigation was advancing faster than I had anticipated. I needed to expedite my plans. I pulled out my phone, dialing Santos. "We need to talk," I said as soon as he answered. "Things are heating up." Santos's voice was low and serious. "My place, 1 hour." "Come alone." I arrived at Santos's apartment exactly an hour later. He ushered me in quickly, checking the hallway before closing the door. "What's going on?" he asked, pouring us each a shot of tequila. I downed mine in one gulp, savoring the burn. "Detective Phillips is onto something. He knows about Toby's cash withdrawals." Santos cursed under his breath. "That complicates things. We need to throw him off the scent." "How?" I asked, refilling my glass. Santos's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. "I've got some contacts in the department. Maybe we can plant some evidence, point them in another direction." I hesitated. "That's risky, Santos. If we get caught, if we don't do something, you're going down for murder." Santos snapped. The word hung in the air between U.S. murder. What I'd done finally had a name, and the weight of it threatened to crush me. But then I thought of Crystal's betrayal, of the life she and Toby had planned to steal from me. "Do it," I said, my voice cold. "Whatever it takes." Santos nodded, a smile on his face. "That's my boy. Now, here's what we're going to do." As Santos laid out his plan, I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. There was no turning back now. The game had changed, and I was all in. The house was quiet when I returned home, Crystal already asleep or pretending to be. I made my way to the study, needing a moment to clear my head. As I settled into my chair, my eyes landed on a stack of papers on Crystal's desk. Something about them nagged at me. I knew I shouldn't look, but the investigator in me couldn't resist. Carefully, I began sifting through the documents. Most were routine work papers, but then I discovered a hidden compartment in the desk drawer filled with letters and printed emails. My hands trembled as I read through them, each word stabbing deeper into my heart. My dearest Toby, one letter began, "I can't wait to start our new life together. Salvador suspects nothing." Another email outlined their plans. Once we drain his accounts, will disappear. He'll be left with nothing, just as he deserves. The malice of their plot struck me like a physical blow. They hadn't just planned to leave me, they intended to utterly destroy me. As I read on, my shock turned to fury. How dare they? After everything I had given Crystal, everything we had built together, I was so absorbed in the letters that I didn't notice the study door opening. Salvador, Crystal's voice made me startle. "What are you doing?" I turned slowly, the condemning evidence clutched in my hand. Crystal's eyes widened as she realized what I had found. "Let me explain," she began, but I interrupted her with a bitter laugh. "Explain what, Crystal?" "How you and your lover planned to ruin me. How you were going to take my daughter, my money, everything." Crystal's face collapsed. "It wasn't like that, Toby. He convinced me." "Don't you dare blame this on him," I retorted, standing up. "Every word here is yours. Your plans, your betrayal." Tears streamed down Crystal's face. "Salvador, please. I made a mistake. We can work this out." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing but scorn. This woman who I had loved and trusted was now a stranger. "Work it out," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Oh, we'll work it out, all right, but not the way you're hoping." Crystal took a step back, fear flashing in her eyes. "What do you mean?" I smiled, and I saw her flinch at the coldness in it. "You wanted to take everything from me, Crystal. Now, I'm going to return the favor." "You can't," she whispered. "The baby." "Ah, yes, the baby," I interrupted. "Tell me, Crystal, is it even mine? Or is this just another part of your sick game?" Crystal's silence was all the answer I needed. I laughed bitterly. "Get out of my sight," I said, turning back to the desk. "And Crystal, don't even think about running. You won't get far." I heard her muffled sobs as she fled the room, but I felt no pity. All I felt was a burning desire for justice, or was it revenge? The next morning, I called Santos. "I need your help again," I said without preamble. I found more evidence about Crystal. Santos let out a low whistle. "Damn, S. What do you want to do?" "I want to destroy her," I said, my voice cold. "Legally, financially, completely. Can you help?" There was a pause. Then Santos chuckled darkly. "Oh, I can help, all right. Meet me in an hour. We've got work to do." As I hung up, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. The man staring back at me was harder, colder than the Salvador Bell of a few weeks ago, but he was also stronger and ready for war. The plan Santos and I concocted was elegant in its simplicity. We would make Crystal believe I was on the verge of confessing everything to the police. The fear of exposure would drive her to desperate measures and right into our trap. I began by dropping hints, leaving files about Toby's case conspicuously around the house. I made hushed phone calls just within Crystal's earshot, speaking vaguely about coming clean and facing the consequences. The effect on Crystal was immediate and dramatic. She became jumpy, her eyes constantly darting around, as if expecting the police to burst in at any moment. One evening, as we sat in tense silence at the dinner table, I decided to push things further. "I can't do this anymore, Crystal," I said, my voice heavy with feigned guilt. "The lies, the secrets, it's eating me alive." Crystal's fork clattered to her plate. "What are you talking about, Salvador?" I met her gaze steadily. "I think it's time I talked to Detective Phillips. Tell him everything I know." The color drained from Crystal's face. "Everything you know about what about Toby?" I said softly. "About you." Crystal shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't, Salvador. Please, think about Victoria." I stood up slowly, letting my face crumple into an expression of anguish. "I am thinking about Victoria. She deserves the truth, even if it hurts." As I turned to leave the room, I heard Crystal's sharp intake of breath. Then suddenly, a searing pain exploded in the back of my head. I stumbled, turning to see Crystal standing there, a heavy vase clutched in her hands, her eyes wild, desperate. "I won't let you ruin everything," she hissed, raising the vase again. But I was ready this time. I ducked under her swing, tackling her to the ground. We grappled on the floor, Crystal clawing and scratching like a cornered animal. Finally, I pinned her arms above her head, my face inches from hers. "It's over, Crystal." I know everything. She went limp beneath me, tears streaming down her face. "How? How did you find out?" I laughed bitterly. "You weren't as clever as you thought. I found your letters, your emails. I know all about your plans with Toby." Crystal's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in fury. "You had no right." "I had every right," I snarled. "You were planning to destroy me, take my daughter, my money, my life. You don't understand," Crystal sobbed. "Toby and we were in love. We wanted a fresh start." I released her arms, standing up and looking down at her with disgust. "And that justified ruining me, taking Victoria away from her father." Crystal struggled to sit up, her voice pleading. "Salvador, please. We can work this out. For Victoria's sake, don't you dare use our daughter as a bargaining chip," I snapped. "You lost that right when you plotted to take her from me." I pulled out my phone, showing her the screen. The voice recorder app had been running the entire time. Crystal's face crumpled as she realized the trap she'd fallen into. "What are you going to do?" I smiled coldly. "Everything you plan to do to me, Crystal. I'm going to take it all: your money, your reputation, custody of Victoria. You'll be left with nothing. You can't," she whispered. "Watch me," I replied, turning towards the door. "Oh, and Crystal, don't bother trying to run. Santos has been watching the house. You're not going anywhere." As I walked out, leaving Crystal sobbing on the floor, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The truth was out, and now, finally, I could begin to take back control of my life. But as I got into my car to drive to Santos's place, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Detective Phillips was still out there, getting closer to the truth every day. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. No matter what came next, I was ready. Crystal and Toby had awakened something in me, a ruthless determination to protect what was mine, no matter the cost. As I pulled up to Santos's apartment, I saw him waiting outside, a smile on his face. "It's done?" he asked as I got out of the car. I nodded, holding up my phone. "Got it all on tape. She confessed everything." Santos clapped me on the shoulder. "Good man. Now let's go inside and plan our next move. Something tells me we're not out of the woods yet." As we walked into his apartment, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The game had changed, the stakes were higher than ever, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had the upper hand. Crystal, Toby, Detective Phillips, they had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. The dim light of Santos's apartment cast long shadows as we pored over the evidence we'd gathered. Photographs, bank statements, and Crystal's damning emails were spread across the coffee table. "Something's not adding up," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "These withdrawals from Toby's account, they're too precise, too calculated." Santos leaned in, his brow furrowed. "What are you thinking?" I pointed to a series of transactions. "Look at the pattern. It's almost like someone was setting him up." Santos finished, his eyes widening. A chill ran down my spine as the pieces started to fall into place. "Santos, what if Toby isn't dead?" Santos sat back, shock evident on his face. "But you said." "I know what I thought I saw," I interrupted. "But what if it was staged? What if this whole thing has been an elaborate con?" Santos shook his head. "That's a hell of a long shot. Why would Toby fake his own death?" I stood up, pacing the room as my mind raced. "Think about it, the perfect crime. He frames me for his murder, runs off with Crystal and my money, and they start a new life somewhere I can't reach them." "But Crystal's still here," Santos pointed out. "Is she?" I countered. "Or is she just waiting for the right moment to disappear?" Santos's eyes narrowed. "If you're right, we need to move fast. Where do we start?" I pulled out my phone, dialing a number I hoped never to use again. "We start by calling in some favors. It's time to dig deeper into Toby Rowe's past." Hours later, fueled by coffee and desperation, we had our answer. Toby Rowe wasn't just alive, he was a ghost, a master of reinvention with a string of aliases and cons across 3 continents. "I'll be damned," Santos whispered as we stared at the evidence. "He played us all." Anger surged through me, hot and fierce. Not yet, he hasn't. We're going to beat him at his own game. Santos looked at me, a glint of admiration in his eyes. What's the plan, boss? I smiled, a plan already forming. We're going to catch a dead man. The next morning, I cornered Crystal in the kitchen. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her movements jittery as she poured her coffee. We need to talk, I said, my voice low and controlled. Crystal flinched. Salvador, please, I've told you everything. I leaned against the counter, fixing her with a hard stare. Have you? Because I think there's one very important detail you've left out. Her hand trembled, coffee spilling over the rim of her mug. I don't know what you're talking about. Toby's alive, isn't he? I asked, watching her reaction closely. The color drained from Crystal's face. For a moment, I thought she might faint. Then, to my surprise, she laughed a hollow, bitter sound. You figured it out, she said, slumping into a chair. I should have known you would. I sat across from her, my voice cold. Start talking, Crystal. Tell me everything, and I mean everything. And so the whole sordid tale came pouring out: Toby's real identity, their elaborate plan to frame me and escape with my fortune. With each word, my anger grew, but so did my determination. Where is he now? I demanded when she finished. Crystal shook her head. I don't know. He was supposed to contact me, but her voice trailed off, fear flickering in her eyes. I stood up, looming over her. Listen carefully, Crystal. You're going to help me find him, and when we do, you're going to play your part perfectly. Understand? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. What are you going to do? I smiled, a predatory gleam in my eye. I'm going to give Toby exactly what he wants, and then I'm going to take everything from him. As I left the kitchen, my phone buzzed a text from Santos. Detective Phillips is sniffing around again. We need to move fast. I typed back a quick reply. Set it up. It's time to end this. I went to the meeting, leaving Victoria and Crystal with Tracy. We explained everything to Detective Phillips, along with the evidence we gathered. He was suspicious of us, but as he connected all the pieces of the puzzle, he understood our discovery and was shocked. Before we wrapped up the meeting, I received a horrifying call from Tracy. Salvador, Toby came to the house. He took Victoria and Crystal with him by force. He gave me an address and told you to come alone with all the savings and money that you have. He warned you to come alone. I was shocked. I told everything to Detective Phillips and Santos. Detective Phillips immediately set up a team for a rescue and gave me instructions to follow. An hour later, we were ready to take down Toby. The pieces were in place. Now it was time for the final act in this twisted game. The warehouse loomed before me, a hulking shadow against the night sky. My heart pounded as I approached, fully aware of the wire hidden beneath my shirt and the gun tucked into my waistband. Santos's voice crackled in my earpiece. Remember, we've got eyes on every exit. If Toby shows, we'll nail him. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. And if he doesn't, then we've still got Crystal's confession. Either way, this ends tonight. I pushed open the rusted door, stepping into the cavernous space. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting eerie shadows across discarded machinery. Crystal, I called out, my voice echoing. I'm here. Where are you? A muffled sob answered me. I rounded a corner to find Crystal tied to a chair, her face streaked with tears and mascara. Salvador, she cried, thank God you're here. He said he'd finish Victoria if I didn't cooperate. I rushed to her side, making a show of checking her bonds. Who, Crystal? Who did this? That would be me, a familiar voice rang out. I spun around to see Toby step out from behind a stack of crates, a gun trained on us. The sight of him alive and smirking sent a surge of rage through me. Toby, I growled, or should I say James Mord. That is your real name, isn't it? Toby's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. Well, aren't you full of surprises, Salvador? I must say, I'm impressed. I straightened up, moving away from Crystal. The game's over, Toby. The police are on their way. He laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. Oh, I don't think so. You see, I've got an insurance policy. He jerked his head towards a dark corner. Come on out, sweetheart. My blood ran cold as Victoria stepped into view, her small hand clasped in the grip of a burly man I didn't recognize. Daddy Victoria's voice trembled. What's going on? I took a step forward, my hands raised. Let her go, Toby. This is between us. Toby's grin widened. On the contrary, Salvador, this has always been about family. Your family, to be precise. What do you want? I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. What I've always wanted, Toby replied. Your money, your life, your identity. And now, thanks to your meddling, I'll have to take your daughter too. Can't leave any loose ends, you understand. Crystal let out a strangled cry. Toby, no. You promised. Toby's face twisted in disgust. Oh, shut up, Crystal. You've outlived your usefulness. In that moment, several things happened at once. Toby swung his gun towards Crystal. I lunged forward, tackling him to the ground, and through my earpiece, I heard Santos shout, now. The warehouse erupted into chaos. Police officers swarmed in from every entrance. The man holding Victoria was quickly overpowered. I grappled with Toby on the floor, fighting for control of the gun. It's over, Toby, I grunted, pinning his arm. Give it up. Toby's eyes blazed with fury. Never, he snarled, headbutting me. I reeled back, my grip loosening. Toby scrambled to his feet, gun raised. Time seemed to slow as I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. Then a single shot rang out. Toby's eyes widened in shock. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest, then crumpled to the ground. I turned to see Detective Phillips lowering his weapon. You all right, mister? Bell, I nodded, still dazed. Victoria's safe, Phillips assured me. We've got her. As the adrenaline faded, the full weight of what had happened hit me. I sagged against a nearby crate, watching as paramedics rushed to Toby's side. Santos appeared at my elbow, his face etched with concern. You did it, S. It's over. I shook my head, my eyes fixed on Crystal as she was led away in handcuffs. Not yet. There's still one more thing to do. In the days that followed, the truth came out. Crystal, facing overwhelming evidence, confessed to everything. Her testimony, combined with the evidence we gathered, was enough to clear my name completely. As I sat in my lawyer's office, signing the final divorce papers, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, certainly, but also a deep, abiding anger at the betrayal I'd endured. Mr. Bell, my lawyer said, interrupting my thoughts, there's one more matter to discuss, your ex-wife. She's requesting visitation rights for Victoria. I looked up. My jaw clenched. Absolutely not. She lost that right when she put our daughter in danger. The lawyer nodded. I thought you might say that. I'll have the papers drawn up to ensure full custody remains with you. As I left the office, I felt lighter than I had in months. The nightmare was over. Toby was dead. Crystal was facing years in prison. And most importantly, Victoria was safe. I drove to pick up my daughter from Santos's place, my mind already turning to the future. We had a lot of healing to do, Victoria and I, but we would do it together, stronger for having survived this ordeal. As I pulled into Santos's driveway, I saw Victoria burst out of the front door, her face lighting up at the sight of me. I scooped her into my arms, holding her tight. Ready to go home, Princess, I asked, my voice thick with emotion. Victoria nodded against my chest. Can we get ice cream on the way? I laughed, feeling truly happy for the first time in ages. Anything you want, sweetheart. Anything you want. As we drove away, I caught sight of Santos in the rearview mirror, watching us go. I owed him more than I could ever repay, but that was a conversation for another day. For now, I had a daughter to spoil, a life to rebuild, and a future that, for the first time in a long time, looked bright. Months passed, and slowly life began to settle into a new normal. The media frenzy around the Bell affair, as they dubbed it, had finally died down. Victoria and I had moved to a new house, a fresh start away from the painful memories of our old life. I sat in my home office reviewing some contracts when my phone buzzed with a text from Santos. Turn on the news now. Frowning, I flipped on the TV. Crystal's face filled the screen, her once perfect makeup now absent, her designer clothes replaced by a prison jumpsuit. Breaking news, the anchor announced. Crystal Bell, convicted conspirator in the infamous Bell affair, has made a full confession, implicating several high-profile individuals in a wide-ranging financial fraud scheme. I leaned back in my chair, a mix of emotions washing over me. Part of me was satisfied to see Crystal facing the consequences of her actions, but another part of part one tried to ignore felt a twinge of something. Not quite regret, but a sort of melancholy for what might have been. My musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," I called. Victoria peeked her head in, her eyes bright. "Daddy, can we go to the park? You promised we'd practice soccer." I smiled, pushing thoughts of Crystal aside. "Of course, princess. Let me just finish up here." As Victoria skipped off to get ready, I turned back to the TV. Crystal was speaking now, her voice trembling. "I made terrible mistakes," she said, looking directly into the camera. "I hurt people I claim to love. If I could take it all back, I would, but I can't. All I can do now is tell the truth and face the consequences." I switched off the TV, sighing heavily. The truth, such a simple concept, yet it had nearly destroyed us all. Later at the park, I watched Victoria chase after the soccer ball, her laughter carrying across the field. Santos jogged up, slightly out of breath. "Sorry I'm late," he panted. "Work's been crazy since the news broke." I nodded, my eyes still on Victoria. "What's the fallout?" Santos shook his head. "It's big. Crystal's testimony has opened up a whole can of worms, arrests, indictments. It's like dominoes falling." I turned to face him. "And us? Are we in the clear?" "Completely," Santos assured me. "Detective Phillips even called to apologize for suspecting you. Said you should consider a career in law enforcement." I laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "I think I've had enough excitement for one lifetime." Santos clapped me on the shoulder. "Can't argue with that. So what's next for Salvador Bell?" I watched as Victoria scored a goal against an imaginary goalkeeper, her arms raised in triumph. Honestly, I'm not sure, but for the first time in a long time, I'm looking forward to finding out. We lapsed into comfortable silence, the afternoon sun warm on our faces. After a while, Santos spoke again, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Listen, about everything that happened, I know I didn't always make the right choices. If I let you down in any way..." I cut him off with a shake of my head. "You were there when it mattered, Santos. I wouldn't have made it through without you." Santos nodded, relief evident in his eyes. "Still, if there's ever anything you need..." "Actually," I said, a smile tugging at my lips, "there is one thing. Victoria's been asking for a dog. Think you could help me pick one out?" Santos laughed, the tension broken. "A dog? That's it? After everything we've been through?" I shrugged. What can I say? My priorities have changed. As we walked over to join Victoria's impromptu soccer game, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The past few months had been a crucible, burning away everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, even myself. But from those ashes, something new had emerged, a stronger bond with my daughter, a deeper appreciation for true friendship, and a resolve to never again take for granted the things that truly mattered. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt ready to face whatever came next. As Victoria's small hand slipped into mine, her face beaming up at me, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together. And really, that was all that mattered. The sun was setting as we left the park, casting long shadows across the grass. Victoria skipped ahead, chattering excitedly about the dog we'd promised to consider. Santos hung back, matching my slower pace. "You know, he said quietly, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about priorities changing." I glanced at him, curious. "Oh." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's time I made some changes too. Settle down, start a family. All this cloak and dagger stuff. It takes its toll, you know." I chuckled, remembering the adrenaline-fueled days of our recent past. That it does, my friend, that it does. As we reached the car, Victoria turned to us, her eyes shining. "Can Uncle Santos come for dinner, please, Daddy?" I looked at Santos, raising an eyebrow in question. He grinned, shrugging. Well, if the lady insists. And so, as the last light of day faded, we drove home together, a family forged in fire, stronger for having weathered the storm. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: whatever came next, we'd face it head-on with the unshakable bond of trust and loyalty we'd fought so hard to build. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching Victoria's excited chatter with Santos, I felt a surge of determination. The past had tried to break us, but we'd emerged victorious. And now, finally, it was time to write a new chapter, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of better days ahead.